We invite you to stay tuned for the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church, located at 271 Mayfield Drive, Smyrna, Tennessee. We will now join the service.
Welcome back to the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study, and we are studying church history through the Trail of Blood, and this is part number 7. In the last part, we considered the church located at Smyrna. We found that this church was a church that is represented by persecutions. When Jesus had John to write to this church, he informed them that they would have tribulations for 10 days. In our study of these scriptures, we saw that Jesus was referring to 10 different time periods. This is one reason why that we think that this church represented a certain time period of 100 through 312 AD. We considered a few of these martyrs in the previous part, but before continuing on with our study from the Trail of Blood, I want to take a closer look at the persecution that arose from the beginning of the Church at Jerusalem through these time periods. In my opinion, I look at 3 periods of persecutions. The first beginning with the stoning of Deacon Stephen. The second being during the Dark Ages. And the third being in the beginning of the new colonies being formed in the quote-unquote New World that later became known as the United States of America. This will be a look at the first period of persecution, while the other 2 will be considered at a later time. So for this part, I have consulted the following historical records. The Bloody Theater, or Martyrs' Mirror of the Defenseless Christians. Philemon J. van Blog, translated from the Dutch language by Joseph F. Sohm, illustrated by Jan Lueken. A History of the Baptist, John T. Christian. Baptist Succession, a Handbook of Baptist History by D.B. Ray. A Concise History of Foreign Baptists by G.H. Orchard. A General History of the Baptist Denomination by David Benedict. A History of the Baptists by Thomas Armitage. Compendium of Baptist History by J.A. Shackelford. Fox's Book of Martyrs, John Fox. Motion's Church History. So beginning with the church at Jerusalem, some historians believe that the persecution began with the Roman Empire, while others believe that it actually started with the Jews, with the members of the church at Jerusalem. Still others believe that persecution started with the death of John the Baptist. Regardless, this first period of persecution was started by the Jews and then continued by the Roman Empire. It continued until the time of Constantine in 313 AD. We'll look at some of them. John the Baptist, son of Zacharias and Elizabeth, beheaded in the castle of Machaerus at the command of Herod and Antipas in AD 32. Stephen, one of the 7 deacons of the church at Jerusalem, stoned without the gate of the city by the libertines in AD 34, shortly after the death of Christ. James, the son of Zebedee, put to death with the sword by Herod Agrippa in Jerusalem, AD 45. He was the brother of John and the first apostle martyred. Philip, bound with his head to a pillar and stoned at Hierapolis in Phrygia, AD 54. James, the son of Alphaeus, or brother of the Lord, cast down from the temple, stoned, and then beaten to death with a club in AD 63. He was reportedly the pastor of the church at Jerusalem at the time, and the one who is said to have knees like as that of a camel, because he was on them so often in prayer. He was supposedly 96 years old at his death. He was also the one who wrote the book of James. Barnabas, companion of the Apostle Paul, dragged out of the city and burned at Salmenia in Cyprus, AD 64. It is believed by some historians that Barnabas was one of the 70 that Jesus sent out. He was originally from Cyprus and then died there. Mark, dragged to the stake at Alexandria, died on the way, April 21st, AD 64. Mark wrote the book of the Bible that carries his name. In AD 66, the Roman persecution began with the Emperor Nero. Nero had ordered the city of Rome to be set afire. When he began to receive the blame, he instead blamed the Christians. Thieleman J. Van Brogg writes, quote, "For this reason there were proclaimed immediately in the name of the emperor throughout the whole known world, then under the monarchy of the Romans, bloody decrees against the Christians, that they should everywhere be put to death." The contents of these decrees were as follows: if anyone confesses that he is a Christian, he shall be put to death without further trial as a convicted enemy of mankind. Thieleman J. Van Brogg again writes, quote, "Touching the manner in which the Christians were tortured and killed at the time of Nero, A. Mellinus gives the following account from Tacitus and other Roman writers, namely, that 4 extremely cruel and unnatural kinds of torture were employed against the Christians. Firstly, that they dressed them in the skins of tame and wild beasts, that they might be torn to pieces by dogs or other wild animals. Secondly, that they, according to the example of their Savior, were fastened alive on crosses, and that in many different ways. Thirdly, that the innocent Christians were burned and smoked by the Romans with torches and lamps under the shoulders and other tender parts of their naked bodies, after these had been cruelly lacerated with scourges or rods. This burning was done also with shavings and faggots, they, the Christians, being tied to stakes worth half a stiver, about 1 cent. Therefore, they called the Christians Sarmentiki, that is, faggot people, and Simisi, that is, half-stiver people, because they stood fastened to half-stiver stakes and were thus burned with a slow fire of faggots. Fourthly, that these miserable, accursed Christian martyrs were used as candles, torches, or lanterns to see them by night. Of those who were burned, some were tied or nailed to stakes and held still by a hook driven through the throat, so that they could not move the head when the pitch, wax, tallow, or other inflammable substances were poured boiling over their heads and set on fire, so that all the unctuous matter of the human body flowing down, made long wide furrows in the sand of the theater. And thus human beings were lighted as torches and burned as lights for the wicked Romans at night. Juvenal and Martial, both Roman poets, and Tertullian state this in a different manner, namely, that the Romans wrapped them in a panful or burning mantle, which they wound around their hands and feet in order to melt the very marrow in their bones. Furthermore, it is stated by A. Molinas from the aforementioned authors concerning these mantles that they were made of paper or linen, and having been thickly coated with oil, pitch, wax, rosin, tallow, and sulfur, were wrapped around their whole body and then set on fire. For this spectacle Nero gave the use of his gardens, and appeared himself among the people in the garb of a charioteer, taking an active part in the Circensian games, himself stand in the circus, and as a charioteer guiding a chariot. These proceedings, according to the testimony of Tacitus, although it had the appearance that the Christians were punished as malefactors, who had deserved the extremest penalty, nevertheless moved the people to compassion. For they understood well enough that the Christians were not exterminated for the good of the common weal, but simply to gratify the cruelty of one man, Nero. Simon Peter, crucified with his head downward under Emperor Nero in AD 69. It is believed that Peter was 70 years old when he died. Paul, solely persecuted and finally beheaded at Rome under the Emperor Nero in AD 69. It is believed that from the record of the scriptures and history, Paul, during the time of 30 years, traveled in Judea, Syria, Asia, Macedonia, Greece, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany. The martyrdom of some of Paul's friends and brethren who were imprisoned with him shortly after he was offered up, besides others who were slain afterwards. It's related that shortly after the death of the Apostle Paul, his brethren and fellow prisoners followed in his footsteps in suffering for the name of Christ. Aristarchus, a traveling companion of Paul, slain at Rome under Nero about AD 70. Epaphras, a fellow prisoner of Paul, slain under Nero about AD 70. 4 fellow laborers and relatives of Paul, namely Prisca, and I believe this to be the same as Priscilla, Aquila, Andronicus, and Junia, martyred at Rome under Nero about 70 AD. Silas or Silvanus, scourged at Philippi in Macedonia, and died a martyr about AD 70. Onesiphorus, a friend of Paul, and Porphyrius, his companion, tied to wild horses and dragged or torn to death at Hellespontus through the edict of Nero about AD 70. Hellespontus is a region on the coasts of the Black Sea. Andrew, crucified at Patras in Acacia about AD 70. Andrew was Peter's older brother. Bartholomew, first greatly tortured, then flayed alive, and finally beheaded in Armenia by King Astyages about AD 70. Thomas, tormented with the red-hot plates, cast into a furnace and his side pierced with spears by the savages at Calamina about AD 70. Calamina was a city in the East Indies. Matthew, nailed to the ground and beheaded at Naddavar under King Hyrtacus about AD 70. Naddavar was the capital city of Ethiopia. Simon Zelotes and his brother Judas Thaddeus, both slain for the truth of Christ, the one crucified and the other beaten to death with sticks about A.D. 70. Matthias, tied to a cross upon a rock, stoned and then beheaded, A.D. 70. John Fox writes that this took place in Jerusalem. Some of the 70 disciples that Jesus had sent out, and several other travelers of the apostles, slain towards the close of the persecution by Nero in A.D. 70. These include Prochorus, one of the 7 deacons at Jerusalem, believed to be a nephew of Deacon Stephen; Nicanor, also of the 7 deacons; Parmenas, one of the 7 deacons; Olympus, imprisoned at Rome with Paul; Carpus, servant of Paul, and afterwards the pastor of the church at Troas, put to death at Troas; Trophimus, Paul's companion, beheaded; Maternus and Egyptus, 2 of the 70 disciples, along with Marianum, a deacon, were put to death in Germany; Hermagoras, pastor of the church at Aquileia, killed by Nero. Aquileia is in Italy. The next persecution of the Christians was under Domitian, which started in A.D. 93. Luke, hanged on a green olive tree in Greece, A.D. 93. Antipas, burned at Pergamus in a red-hot brazen ox, A.D. 95. John, banished to the Isle of Patmos by Emperor Domitian, A.D. 97. From what can be determined from historical records, John was on Patmos from 97 to 99. Thus, the book of Revelation was written sometime between 97 and A.D. 99. Domitian, who had banished John to Patmos, had died, and Nerva became ruler in his place. John was delivered and brought back to Ephesus, where he had previously been pastor of the church. He died a natural death there at the age of 80. He was the only apostle to die a natural death. Timothy, stoned to death by the heathen idolaters at Ephesus, about A.D. 98. Urticanus, a pious Christian, beheaded with the axe at Ravenna, Italy, A.D. 99. Vitellius, buried alive at Ravenna, and his wife beaten to death with sticks at Milan, about A.D. 99. Beginning around A.D. 100, different other persons who were slain for the name of Christ, about A.D. 100. Van Brock writes, according to ancient history, there were also slain for the testimony of the Son of God. In France, Lucianus, bishop of the church of Bellevaco, Maximus and Julianus, elders, Nicanus, bishop of the church at Rouen, Quirinus, an elder, Scribicalus, a deacon, Pacinia, a virgin. In Italy, Romulus, bishop of the church of Festula, and others in different places. Simon Cleophas, one of the 70 disciples, crucified by Atticus under Trajan, A.D. 109. Historians record that Simon Cleophas was 125 years of age when he died. He was the son of the brother of Joseph, Jesus' stepfather. After the death of James, the apostle and pastor of the church at Jerusalem, he became the pastor. Rufus and Zoemus, beheaded at Philippi in Macedonia, AD 109. Paul mentions Rufus in Romans chapter 16 and verse 13. Salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. The Ethiopian eunuch of Queen Candace, who was baptized by Philip, put to death for the name of Christ in the island of Caprobano in AD 110. Thieleman J. Van Brogg writes, "It is stated of him from Jerome that he preached the gospel of our Lord in Arabia Philia, and also in a certain island of the Red Sea, called Caprobano, some call it Ceylon, where it is supposed he suffered death for the testimony of the truth." Ignatius, a disciple of the Apostle John, devoured by wild beasts in a circus at Rome in AD 111. Onesimus, a friend of Apostle Paul, brought from Rome to Ephesus and there stoned to death in AD 111, shortly after the death of Ignatius. Dionysius Areopagita, who was converted by Paul, martyred for confessing Jesus about the year 112. Thieleman J. Van Brogg writes, "We read in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 17, verse 34, that among those who clave unto the doctrine of Paul, there was also Dionysius, one of the Athenian council, and a woman named Damaris. Paul supposedly appointed him the pastor of the church at Athens." Publius, Barcimaeus, Barbeluus, and his wife Barba, slain about 112. Publius was the pastor of the church at Athens, apparently succeeding Dionysius. Barcimaeus was the pastor of the church at Edessa and was slain with him, and Barbeluus and his sister Barba, who apparently were of the church at Edessa. Edessa is located in Turkey and is now called Urfa, a city of 80,000 in population today. Phocas, pastor of Pontus, put to death in a lime kiln and in boiling water at Sinope, about 118. Sinope is located in the northern Turkey on the coast of the Black Sea. Faustina and Jacobita, put to death at Brescia in Italy, and Elantherus with his mother Anthea and others at Messina in Sicily in 120. Severe persecutions of untold number of believers, about 130. Getulicus, a teacher at Frivoli in Italy, Symphorosa with her sons, and Cyrillus and Amantius were put to death in that city. Also Sapphira, a maiden from Antioch, and Sabina, a widow of Valentinus, were slain in Rome in 136. Ptolemy and his impromptu defender Lucius, put to death in Alexandria, Egypt, about 144. Lucius, at the trial of Ptolemy, protested to the judge concerning the sentence and execution that had been rendered to him. As a result, Lucius was also killed under the same sentence. Felicitas, a Christian widow at Rome, and her 7 sons, put to death at Rome in 164. So in conclusion, for part 7, we will continue with the Roman persecutions in our next part, number 8. Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Versus, continued the persecution of the Christians around the year 166.